We're going to talk about sex-linked inheritance today. What happens if the genes are on the sex chromosomes of animals, and how that's a little bit different from what Mendel would have ever predicted. Remember that Mendel only worked with pea plants, and plants don't have sex chromosomes. So the only real difference here is to consider males. Males are the only ones that have slightly different chromosomes for the sex chromosome pair. This is the only pair of chromosomes that's out there that aren't truly homologous, even though they do line up together in meiosis I. So males have an X chromosome and a Y chromosome, and they carry different genes on them. So when we consider our sex-linked inheritance, by the way, we're only ever going to consider genes that are on the X chromosome. There are genes on the Y chromosome, and there are sometimes Y-linked inheritance considerations, but we're not going to do that in this course. So if the gene is on the X chromosome, then we want to show that it's only on the X. The DNA still duplicates in interphase as always. The homologous pairs still line up like so in meiosis I. They're still split apart in meiosis I, and then the sister chromatids in meiosis II. And so all I'm trying to show here is that potentially a male might either pass on his X chromosome with that gene on it, or he might pass on the Y chromosome to a son. And so when we do Punnett square problems like this, we just want to be clear and write the chromosomes because for males especially there are different chromosomes, and we just want to typically the gene and the allele that the male has on his X chromosome is written as a superscript on the X, just to make it very clear that we're not putting this gene on the Y. A lot of students make mistakes here. They'll write, a B on the Y chromosome as well. And so the whole purpose of putting the chromosomes in there is just to show, unlike the autosomes, that the male only has one X. So really, males can either be dominant in genotype or recessive in genotype. There is no such thing as homozygous or heterozygous without two versions of the gene on the two chromosomes. So as we're going to discuss as well in a sample problem, males are also going to be much more likely to show the recessive phenotype for sex-linked recessive traits. All right, females are very similar to autosomal considerations because they have two X's. So not a lot is different for them. They're still going to copy the DNA as before, split up the homologous pairs, split up the sister chromatids. They're going to pass on an X. That's not a question. It's just that if they carry a slightly different allele on the chromosome pair, it's a question of which allele do they pass on in each particular gamete. So we're still going to write XX for females because we want to make it clear that that is the female in that Punnett square part of the problem. And just like always, females can be heterozygous, homozygous dominant, or homozygous recessive. All right, so let's just do some sample problems here, and we'll illustrate how this is put to use. So hemophilia is an example of a sex-linked recessive trait in humans. Not having it is dominant, so let's show that it's on the X chromosome here. I don't know why this program does that. X chromosome, and let's say that dominant is not having it. And let's say that then the recessive is having it. And we're going to cross a carrier mother with a dad who does not have hemophilia. So let's perhaps go over to this side. Mom has to be XX. That's her genotype. And if she's a carrier, that's another way of saying she carries the recessive allele without showing the trait. So that means she's heterozygous. If dad does not have hemophilia, dad's XY. If he doesn't have it, that must mean his one X has a dominant letter. So let's show this cross in a Punnett square then. So let's go ahead and rewrite mom and dad. We can always think about the gametes they might produce. Mom might either pass on her dominant allele or her recessive allele. Dad might pass on his X with the dominant allele, or he might pass on the Y. So let's go ahead and draw that Punnett square out. So here is mom, here is dad. When we show the results, we get this. So let's analyze the Punnett square. First of all, you should see that there's always going to be a 50-50 chance of having a daughter or a son. That's just how the Punnett square will come out. You also see that father is going to be the determinant of the sex of the child because mom is guaranteed to pass on an X chromosome. So the real question is, does the sperm fertilize that carries an X? If so, you'll have a daughter. Does the sperm fertilize that carries the Y? Then you'll have a son. We see, interestingly, that neither parent showed any phenotype of having hemophilia, and yet they could potentially have a chance of having a child, in this case a son, who has hemophilia. So there's sort of a 1 in 4 chance that they have a child with hemophilia showing. Here's a daughter, but because she carries the dominant allele of not having it, she will not have hemophilia. And so an interesting case where neither parent shows having the trait and yet they have a child that has it. And it shows up disproportionately in males because they only have one X. Notice also that how did that son get that allele? He got it from mom. Dad's only passing on the Y. So typically this is passed from mothers to sons is typically how this often works. This is kind of a classic Punnett square showing how sex-linked inheritance often works. So let's do a second example really quick. We could do red-green color blindness is also a sex-linked recessive trait in humans. So maybe capital R is not being colorblind, lowercase r is being colorblind. And let's cross a colorblind father, so that would be, he'd be XY. He only has one gene on his X, and if he is colorblind, it's recessive. And if mom is homozygous dominant, that means she has two X's and that they're both capital R. So let's think about that Punnett square. If mom is homozygous dominant, then there's really only one gamete she can pass on, and that's an X capital R. Dad can pass on his X or his Y. So I'm just going to draw a 1×2 Punnett diagram here. I'm going to put mom and her one gamete on the top. I'm going to draw dad and his two gametes at the sides. Okay, and what do we have? We have that neither child, neither daughters nor sons will show color blindness, although the daughters will be carriers. So notice here another interesting example of dad actually had the trait, but none of the children will. It will sort of disappear in that generation. He can't pass it on to his sons because his sons get the Y from him. So again, this is something that's typically passed from mother to son based on how it works.